So great. Let's get started then with questions. And um, so the first one is from Jason.
Okay.
Yes, and Jason asks, in TMI, you advocate a combination of concentration and insight practice, whereas in MCTB, Daniel advocates separating the two practices. However, in stage 7, you give two separate practices, close following and cultivating the pleasure jhanas. Clearly, they both require some level of concentration and insight, but close following seems to be more of an insight practice since it involves investigation of the sensations, breaking them apart to see impermanence, whereas jhana is more of a concentration practice in which one is absorbed in the breath as one object, which can't be investigated, broken apart without breaking the absorption. In stage 7 plus, how should one decide how much investigation to apply? Okay, there's a number of terminological things here that I think some clarification will make it easier to answer these questions. First of all, the term concentration. I would like to refer to that as either samadhi or attentional stability. And so what would restate this as a combination of cultivating attentional stability and doing a practice which is intended to induce an insight experience, which may or may not actually give rise to insight. So there are practices that have been developed because they are conducive to insight. Now, attentional stability is necessarily a part of insight practices like the one particular insight practice that's being referred to here. And that is one where you're using attention rather than mindfulness. Well, a little clarification here. When I say mindfulness, I really mean metacognitive introspective awareness. Well, at least in the most general sense, it's extrospective and introspective awareness. But to become fully developed mindfulness, it is metacognitive introspective awareness. So both are necessary for anything to be an insight practice, although they aren't clearly identified as such. Now, as far as a practice that leads to insight goes, okay, the idea of of investigating sensations and breaking them apart to see impermanence. Now that is one way of precipitating insight into impermanence with overtones of insight into the impermanence of the self. And the use of attention in this way it is just specific to this particular way, to this particular insight practice. So properly speaking, there are all kinds of insight practices that don't utilize attention in this way, and some that depend much more upon mindfulness, powerful mindfulness, and either attention is not involved or attention plays an ancillary role. And so basically there's everything in between. But in these practices of doing very intense investigation with attention and seeing things, if you did not have the mindfulness to absorb the nature of the information that was being given rise to, then it would not be an insight practice. So to make these kinds of distinctions is I think illusory and confusing. One cannot do this kind of practice without developing a degree of attentional stability. So we look at it this way, and there are practices to develop attentional stability, and they usually develop mindfulness together. And so this distinction between a concentration practice and an insight practice is a bit problematic. We should think more in terms of what is any particular practice trying to do and how does it fit into a larger scheme of things. Okay, so anyway, your question, Jason, clearly they both require some level of concentration and insight, obviously. But close following seems to be more of an insight practice since it involves investigation of sensations. Yes, and that is the case. And jhana is more of a concentration practice in which one is absorbed in the breath as one object, which can't be investigated, broken apart without breaking the absorption. Yes, jhana is a powerful insight practice, but it does not work on the basis of using attention to reductively deconstruct things. That's not how it's used. And as a matter of fact, in the jhanas, I know there's a lot of different people who have struggled with interpreting the words vitakka and vichara, but what they are, quite simply, are directed and sustained attention. And of course, people equate attention with consciousness, and they think, well, how could, if vitakka and vichara fall away after first jhana, then somebody must be unconscious. And that doesn't make sense. Therefore, we have to find some other thing. So people come up with all kinds of crazy things, you know, directed and applied effort, directed and applied thought, thought and investigation, and all kinds of weird things for these things. But it really is attention. And attention falls away in the early jhanas, usually after first jhana, according to classical description. And it is a practice by which, as you move through the jhanas, you're experiencing the mind essentially at different, it's like peeling the layers off of an onion, and you're experiencing the mind through powerful mindfulness in the second, third, fourth jhanas and the formless jhanas, rather than through attention. And these can be made into an insight practice, and I think we're probably the predominant insight practice at the time of the Buddha. So yes, they can be used to develop stability of attention. As soon as you have enough stability of attention to enter a jhana, like a light jhana, like the whole body jhana, or a little more stability of attention to enter into the pleasure jhanas, then what this does is helps to condition your mind to that kind of stability. Of the flow aspect of jhana produces an incredible stability of attention. And so practicing the jhanas help to develop a stability of attention that's not dependent upon the flow state. It's independent of it. So, how, you go on to say, in stage 7 plus, how should one decide how much investigation to apply? Well, since everything in stage 7 on, these are insight practices that are being used to help further develop both mindfulness and help you actually learn to use the profoundly stable attention. When you get to, when in stage 7, you have what's referred to as upachara samadhi or access samadhi, because you can sustain exclusive attention, but it takes effort. And when it becomes effortless, it becomes apana samadhi. And that's basically the qualitatively, the stability of attention, the samadhi that is qualitatively the same as what you achieve when you enter the jhanas. So the jhanas help you learn to develop this. Now you can use this. And all of the practices that are offered in stage 7 plus, they serve, they are insight practices. But don't worry about whether or not, well, how to put this, whether or not any particular practice involves using attention as a part of the investigation, number one, and number two, whether or not that attention is used reductively and deconstructively rather than just a simple observation through attention, which allows analytical powers of attention to absorb the information from it, but there doesn't need to be an active deconstruction taking place. So don't worry whether either one of those two or both of them is present in a practice, because all of these other practices are insight practices. If you look at the practices in stage 8, momentary attention, following the links of dependent arising and things like that, you are using attention, but you're not using attention analytically. You're using attention as the powerful spotlight that brings us information makes it available to all of the unconscious subminds that are participating in this process. When you get to practices like still point witness, where attention is actually quite minimalized, and then you get into practices like meditation on the mind, where the way you enter into that state is largely by releasing attention anytime it begins to coalesce around an object. So the simple answer is these practices in stage 7 and all of the practices subsequently are both attentional stability practices and insight practices. And insight practice is not defined by attentional analysis. That's only a single approach that is used in certain circumstances. I hope that clarifies that point for you, Jason, and for everybody else. I know it's going to come as a surprise to some of you who have been indoctrinated in the idea that insight practice is essentially something something that is primarily involves attention and is primarily analytical. And in fact, there's almost no mention of this kind of insight practice in the suttas.
I guess it's just that, like, sometimes it seems like you can emphasize more the smoothness and like the pleasurable smoothness that's kind of leading towards jhana, and then sometimes, or you could go the other way and just break down everything and continue going down the more, like looking more into impermanence, and it's not necessarily as pleasurable, right? So I was just kind of wondering, you know, how does one decide which one is more appropriate at any given time?
Well, think in terms, what I would recommend is if you're following TMI, think in terms of what are the objectives of that particular stage of the practice, and where are you in terms of those objectives, and which practice might be most helpful to you. Now, if you want to work towards insight, insight is going to arise spontaneously sometime in this period. But if you want to more intentionally direct yourself towards insight, then I haven't really given detailed instructions on how to use jhana as an insight practice. So I would choose for stage 7 that you use the close following and the investigation of symbolic and non-symbolic thought, because these actually the close following is the one that is most likely to trigger an insight experience and the development of insight at stage 7.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Glad I could clarify that. Let's see, next question.
Oh, Chilidasa,
Mhm.
do you have any way of putting your computer on a solid surface? Because it's sort of bouncing around and moving up, or
Oh, yeah.
that requires some surgery?
Yeah, I can do that.
Uh-oh, I've sent you on a mission.
All right. And position it so that you can see me.
Yeah, occasionally you drop off at the bottom.
Yes. Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah,
So-
thanks on behalf of people like me with weak stomachs who get a little queasy when it's bouncing around.
Sorry, I didn't mean to make you car sick.
Oh, I'm a cheap date in that respect.
Okay. Now let's look at what the next question is here. Stephen Cartledge, I believe during a Q&A you mentioned that exploring hypnagogia mindfully would be interesting and maybe beneficial. Do you have suggestions on how to mindfully study hypnagogic states? Relating to this, do you see any correlation between them? Well, let's answer the first question. You go to sleep every night, and if you practice being mindful going to sleep at night, then you're going to experience hypnagogia and hypnagogic images as a part of that. So that provides you with an ideal opportunity to study hypnagogia. Now, depending on what stage of the practice you're in, you may experience that with the onset of strong dullness. As progressive subtle dullness moves into strong dullness, hypnagogic imagery arises. And if you want to explore that, I'm really curious what your reasons would be for exploring that. I can think of a lot of good reasons. I'm not questioning that it's not a good idea, because I think it's a very good idea to practice mindfulness both when you're going to sleep and when you're waking up in the morning. And you'll have images in the morning too, which are hypnopompic rather than hypnagogic, but same idea basically.
Because of some physical pain, I have to really meditate more in an easy chair. So even though it doesn't feel like dullness per se, I end up at some point falling asleep due to medications and different things. So it's sort of like the states of meditation go from a state of, mindfulness or watching the breath steadily. And then all of a sudden, I'm waking up and having those hypnagogic type images. So I'm just thinking, is there a way to, when you were in that twilight zone, is there something to, and also I have interest in developing lucid dreaming. So I was thinking that the investigation of reality between those three states, of interest to me right now.
Right. Yes. Well, practicing mindfulness before you go to sleep or as you fall asleep is also conducive to lucid dreaming, but there are other techniques but I would, that would be great to explore that. So we want to look at the three states of what it's like to be awake, what it's like to be in that transition towards sleep, and in the dream state. And that sounds like a really great idea. If I look at this as a practice question, though, okay, so you have pain and you're on medications, and it produces a tendency to dullness. And what I think you need from the point of view of practice is to develop the ability to distinguish what is a highly alert state of mind, where you have a lot of clarity, vividness in your perception, from those dull or semi-dull states of mind, where it is not as clear and where certain distortions become like hypnagogic hallucinations or dreams, semi-dreams, and things like that. So from a practice point of view, I think that's what it sounds to me like you're asking, is how to learn to clearly distinguish between those states. Well, I would focus on things that are indicative of a high state of alertness, and become familiar with that. Now, I think a hypnagogic state is obviously a state of dullness, although there is a kind of mindfulness that we talk about in the 7th interlude of The Mind Illuminated, that allows you to sustain a high level of mindfulness in a hypnagogic state. But I think in terms of having the particular obstacles you do to maintaining a high state of alertness and mindfulness and clarity of attention, that the approach is probably better to focus on what it's like, what are the different degrees and different levels of alertness, and the quality of perception that's associated with them. Is that helpful in regard to that question? Am I on track with what your needs are? You're muted. You're muted, Steve. Couldn't hear what you said.
Yes, it gives me something to work on. I'm thankful. That's what I was looking for.
Okay, there's another part to your question here. Do I see any correlation between between synesthesia and seeing the breath as in the way the Pawak jhanas are practiced, and how does that compare to the synesthesia of an acid trip, seeing the music? Well, that's an interesting question. I find that the merging of the breath with the luminous phenomena that is used by Pawak and teachers in his tradition is an interesting little twist on things. And probably there's similar, I'm just guessing, probably there's similar brain mechanisms that are taking place to produce that kind of synesthesia, because, and it is probably something similar to what can happen with LSD. I just see it as an example of interesting phenomenology. But for those who are academically interested in the exploration of various perceptual effects, it's probably a much deeper and more exciting question, and I don't have much answer to beyond what I've just told you. So, okay. Let's see. Boris, yes. Is Boris here? Oops.
Yes, I'm here.
Good, great, Boris. So in one of your Q&A, you answered a question about formal and informal practices from second to third path. It was insanely helpful for my practice. What practices you recommend for third to fourth path? Yeah, that'll be an interesting thing for us to talk about for a few minutes. When you have achieved third path, you have overcome craving for basically what's referred to as the 8 worldly dharmas: gain, loss, pleasure, pain, fame, infamy, praise, blame, you know, these things. So there are, in terms of being a state, freedom from craving and freedom from the dukkha that is associated with it, it's quite a wonderful attainment. But what remains is that our meditator who's achieved third path, she knows she's not, she knows that there isn't a self, but she still feels that sense of being a separate self. And so that's present as a part of third path experience, is, you know, and as it's expressed in one of the suttas where someone who's on third path is talking to some younger bhikkhus and explains that even though I know it's not true, I still experience I, me, and mine. So so it's a place of being freed of almost every kind of delusion, except for the having the knowledge that you're not a separate self, but feeling like you're a separate self. Now, another thing that is a part of this is since there is still a feeling of separateness, then on third path, one experiences, on the one hand, the godlike experience of being in a state of peace and not being disturbed by things of the world and so on and so forth. It's associated with a powerful sense of blissful happiness. But the meditator on third path at some point begins to experience a kind of dukkha, dissatisfaction. And this is a result of a tension that develops, a tension between being and non-being, or sometimes as is put, tension between craving for existence in the formless realms versus craving for existence in the form realm. This is, and from the vantage point of somebody who is not being driven by craving, this form realm, this sense realm, it can be appreciated as an exquisitely wonderful and beautiful thing to have the opportunity to experience. It is indeed experiencing it as it is, as an aspect of suchness reflected in our own minds. But the other thing is, remember our third path meditator, she knows she's not separate. And despite the wonderful, the ability to enjoy and see things from the perspective that she's attained, she's very well aware that this world is filled with incredible amounts of suffering. And so that is why there's this tension between being and non-being, or wanting to withdraw from the world of form into some sort of godlike formless realm where there is no suffering. But that is unresolvable, because she knows that you know, even though she feels separate, she's not separate, and any kind of escape is not going to change what's bothering her. So basically, she's in a state of existential angst. She has the fetter of feeling like she's a separate self, which gives rise to the phenomenon of craving for being or non-being, or you know, the conflict between being a part of all of this suffering and at the same time being apart from it, being a part of it and apart from it. Interesting linguistically there, what I just said, but in terms of how this gets resolved. So these 4 of the 5 fetters that you want to overcome in the practice in a third path is, of course, this ongoing sense of being a separate self, the craving for being and non-being, the restlessness or agitation, the existential dukkha that is associated with, that arises from this craving for being and non-being. And the 5th is just, the 5th fetter is ignorance. And that what that means is it refers to the complete falling away of all aspects of the delusion that our meditators started out in. So if we understand, then this is the real value of the 10 fetter model. It helps to tell you what to do and what to work on and how to practice. So what you're looking for is to is for this sense of being a separate self to fall away. And as a third path meditator, it does fall away at times, and there are practices that you can do that in particular are devoid of much in the way of sense of self. For example, if you were to take the practice of experiencing the witness and bring it to its culmination, that's a way to do it. Or the meditation on the mind, which we reach a place where there is no sense of a self involved in that anymore. In our daily lives, it's just a recognizing whenever this sense of self, of being a separate self, is present, and observing it with mindfulness. As far as a craving for being and non-being, what one needs to do is to just observe observe the way these cravings arise, what they arise in response to, and observe the dissatisfaction, the suffering that arises from them, and attempt to surrender. Remember, craving is resistance to what is. And so if you remember that craving is a resistance to what is, then you know how to deal with craving, even these kinds of very subtle by comparison to our other cravings. You know how to deal with these, which is to surrender to what is. The more completely you surrender to what is, the more you're going to reach that culmination of the insights at that third path, which allow for transition to fourth path. Now, the restlessness and tension that's present, use that mainly, that's mainly a sign to know that you need to observe what happens and how your mind reacts to it, and then surrender to whatever it was that triggered that craving to arise. So the main way you use the fetter of restlessness or dukkha, the dukkha that results from craving for being and non-being, is this reminds you to surrender more and more completely. It's very good to do practices. I mean, this in your daily life, it's extremely important that you're practicing the way that the mindful review provides you the instruction for. By third path, you have incredibly powerful mindfulness. You're observing your own mind, and you can see whenever there is some aspect of this remaining sense of separation that is operating in your mind. And so you can look at, basically what I'm saying is you can look at the fetters, you can look at the nature of it, and you will know how to practice. And some of the more advanced practices, like overcoming, experiencing, and eventually the falling away of the witness and the meditation on the mind, these are all very good. But in your daily life, practicing virtue, practicing loving kindness, things like this, where what you are doing in those practices is you are minimizing the experience of being separate in any way. You are increasing the sense of connectedness with everything else. And this is what eventually the kind of insight that's going to arise. There's going to be a falling away of the sense of self, and the insight, sort of underlying all of the other insights, are various aspects of non-duality. Non-duality of self and other, non-duality of mind and matter. I mean, that's what emptiness points to, things like that. But the last non-duality, the insight into non-duality that is going to bring you across the threshold of fourth path, is the non-duality of being and non-being. And this is rather, what does that mean? A little bit hard to explain, except that it's extremely obvious once you see it. But maybe just a pointer to that is, what is suchness? Suchness is everything that is, everything that has been, everything that potentially could be, everything that could be but isn't, that might happen but won't. And it's also everything that couldn't happen as well. So within the totality of suchness, there is no such distinction as being and non-being. And fourth path is really dwelling in suchness. And so this kind of contradiction is completely dissolved in that. So hope that gives you some idea of the practices to follow if you find yourself on third path. If you know where you're going, then you can tell whether you can choose your practices appropriately, and you can tell whether they're taking you in the right direction or not. You will have an increased experience of the falling away of that sense of separateness. You will have an increased appreciation of, well, all of the other insights are going to be deepening. So you're going to experience an increased appreciation of the significance of everything as interconnected, everything as process, that all mental constructs are merely attempts by the mind to represent on very limited information a much greater reality. All of this is going to help you bring you to that place of surrender. So the more more easily you can surrender to what is, the closer you are getting to the culmination of the third path and transition to fourth path.
Thank you. It was very wonderful to hear that. Can I just elaborate a little bit? Just a little remark. I find that if I take awareness as object of my meditation and then I can watch that watcher, and then I take watcher as my object, and then it dissolves, and I go to non-dual state. Like Rigpa, you can say that. Is this good practice or?
Yes, yes, a very good practice. Yes. Okay. Jared asks, do you think there are any common misconceptions of the middle way? Well, by the middle way, Jared, are you referring to, are you using that as a euphemism for Buddha Dharma, as it's understood in the world? Or do you mean something more specific by that?
Probably the Buddha Dharma perspective, yeah.
Yes, right. It's so packed with misconceptions. I mean, the Buddha did nail it when he said that that what he taught would degenerate over time, and it is riddled with misconceptions. Yes, and we're at a time now where I think that we have the opportunity to relieve ourselves of many of those misconceptions, which is going to make it easier for people to achieve insight and awakening. Because most of those misconceptions in one way or another create new and unnecessary obstacles to insight and awakening. So, you know, I could think of one in particular that makes a tremendous difference. And that's if somebody is practicing Buddhism and their goal is insight and awakening, and they cling to the belief that there is some kind of essence to them, something, some immaterial essence, or their consciousness or mind stream or something like that, that constitutes a self that is going to continue after the dissolution of the body. And what this does is it makes it so much more difficult to let go of the yeah, let's put it this way. It makes it so much more difficult to realize anatta, right? And somebody who is deeply indoctrinated in the idea that there is some kind of self that would fit the description of reincarnation, they might be able to drop that enough to become a stream entrant. So then they're living with an internal conflict of, well, I know that there's no self in this mind and these five aggregates, yet I still feel like a separate self. So maybe my knowledge is incomplete and there's some other kind of self. And so then they go looking for some other kind of self to rationalize that. And another huge misperception has to do with karma and The Buddha said that when I say karma, I mean intention. And it goes on to speak at a lot of length about intention. It is your intentions that give rise to your speech and action. And those intentions that you act on determine how you're going to respond, how you're going to respond to any given situation. So they shape who you are. So karma, as the Buddha used the word, doesn't mean that what you do determines what's going to happen to you in the future, in this lifetime, or in some next lifetime. Yes, there is causality, and your acts are going to have consequences, but they're consequences that can be understood on the basis of physical causality, chemical causality, psychological causality, mental causality, things like that. But karmic causality is the way that we shape ourselves through the intentions that we follow. And it's so the fruits of karma are not about what happens to you, it's about who they happen to. And through right intention, right thought and intention, they will happen to somebody who has attained to a higher path of awakening. They'll happen to a bodhisattva who has a significant degree of realization. If those intentions are of the wrong kind, then that's not going to happen. And as a matter of fact, you're probably going to go the other way. You're going to become more immersed in the world of suffering. So the whole idea of karma, just like the idea of reincarnation, these were ideas that pre-existed the Buddhas. They were ideas that got incorporated into Buddhism because the Buddha took those ideas, redefined those terms, and used them in a highly specific way. So when we go back to understanding them, not in the way the Buddha redefined them, but in their original form, then they become obstacles to our spiritual development. Yeah, the middle way of the Dharma, an interesting comment from Andrea, which is really true. Everyone thinks their way is the middle way. That's the other thing about it, yeah. I suppose there's the extreme of nihilism leading to suicide at one end, and at the other end is total self-destructive debauchery. And anything between those can be interpreted as a middle way of some sort. So, yeah, kind of a fun question to address.
Thank you.
And Joel, I really enjoyed seeing that article. I'd love to read the original paper. So Joel posted, and maybe hopefully some of you read it, an article entitled "The Spotlight of Attention is More Like a Strobe, Say Researchers." And there's a link to that. What I found, well, it was fascinating the way they described it. Now, they found the frequency of attention in their study to be to arise, strobe on and off, 4 times per second. And what happened between those strobings on and off, or let's say those moments of attention. So let's go to the Abhidhamma description here. Between those moments of attention, what they described as happening is a broader perception of everything else that is going on around them. And of course, that is awareness. So what they're describing here is it's moments of attention alternating with moments of awareness. And I find that fascinating. Something that's a little peculiar is that they come up with such a low frequency for attention, but that's why I'd like to read the paper in itself, because I suspect it's the experimental design that that led to such a low rate of attention, episodes of attention. But it's fascinating that this research is being done, and that what's really fascinating is the way it's being interpreted, recognizing that there's two different ways of perceiving that are alternating with each other in this study. Yeah, I found that to be a wonderful thing, to know that people are working on that and are starting to go in the right direction with it. So thank you very much, Joel. And those of you that haven't, I mean, how many of you have had already seen this link and had read that article? Not very many of you. Yeah, you'll find it really interesting to see scientists actually describing what dates back to the time of the Abhidhamma, and which is articulated in the Mind Illuminated. A lot of attention given to it. So it's very validating. Let's put it this way. Yeah. I just noticed that Katyana had posted a little comment here. From the heart of the universe is the heart of the universe is process. There's nothing to hold on to. Yes. Would you say that not one, or not two, not one, is what you are directing us to? And yes, as a matter of fact, we'll go into some detail on that. But I think Katyana has a question coming up here anyway.
So I was really thinking when you were speaking about that, prapancha comes up always, and going beyond all symbols, language, concepts, and then emptiness, going beyond emptiness. And so you're peeling and unpeeling and unpeeling the layers and layers and layers. And then finally realizing that whole process is what the cosmos is anyway. And it's like one giant spiral that has spirals within spirals within spirals, the fractals that are repeating, and there is no beginning or ending. It's just continuous until you let go of everything.
Now, the idea is to bring yourself to a place of conscious understanding of that as best your human mind is capable of, and dwelling in the place of that greater reality.
Thank you so much.
Next question in order here is Ferdy. So I'm at a stage where at most days, after a few minutes, halfway through the 4-point transition, I got lots of meditative joy and tranquility going, which to me sounds like stage 8. The body is feeling really nice. Awareness seems expanded, and I sense thoughts and feelings as vibrations most of the time. It feels natural to do the witness or meditation on the mind. If I do this, though, I will get subtle, gross distractions after some time. When I try to do stage 4, then I don't really feel sensations at the nose. Everything feels so expansive that it feels kind of forced to make these solid sensations. I just want to clarify with you, Ferdy, are you saying that your normal practice state corresponds to stage 4? It's Ferdy here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can.
Okay. So no, it's so and sometimes I am stage 4, but on So on the days where my mind is really sharp, I am at stage 8. But the thing is that
Okay.
then when I'm practicing at stage 8, it's fun and going pretty good for some time. But then there comes a period where there are like some thoughts are like getting past my
Mhm.
mindfulness, and then
Mhm.
I'm in a state where I don't really know what to do to get back to this to stage 8.
Mhm. I see. Okay, so this is what it sounds like to me, and you can tell me if it makes sense to you. It sounds like that you are able to do stage 8 practices, and the quality that you described of that really with the reference to tranquility in particular, but to joy, and it actually sounds like you're able to be in a state that corresponds to late stage 8, almost into stage 9, but that you have some problems sustaining it. And if I've described this accurately, would you say that's an accurate description? That you're right, okay.
I would say so, yeah.
So let's look at what could be the explanation for the problems sustaining it and what we could do about that. So what you're basically saying is that the effortless exclusive attention and metacognitive introspective awareness that you seem to be able to manifest is not sufficiently supported by the mind system yet. So it's like being able to have effortless exclusive attention, but not necessarily being able to stay in that place for very long periods of time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
All right.
that's true. Yeah.
So what I would suggest that you do is to practice with the practice in such a way that you can immediately detect any arising of subtle or gross distractions, any instability of your attention, and where you can likewise recognize any diminishing of the clarity and the intensity and the vividness of your perception and the practice that you're doing. Now you could do this just going back to following the breath at the nose, like in stage 7, but you could also do this while doing some of these, some of the other earlier stage 8 practices, but putting the emphasis on when you're doing these practices, the emphasis on being aware of being extremely aware. And that's really what these practices are about in the first part of stage 8 chapter. Being extremely aware of what attention is doing and being extremely aware what the mind as a whole is doing. And so if you are aware of what the mind as a whole is doing, if you are aware of what attention is doing, then you should immediately see when the attention begins to alternate with something. Or you should immediately recognize when the quality of your perception is starting to show signs of dullness, where there's any kind of collapse in your introspective awareness taking place. And then, correct for that. So in other words, I think you need to do a little more work in making this state of effortless, exclusive attention and powerful mindfulness more stable. It's not stable, make it more stable. How did you make it stable in the first place? By simply being on guard for any manifestations of distraction, being vigilant for any signs of distraction or dullness arising and immediately correcting for them until the point comes that it was not necessary to do so. So now what you're going to do is something that's very similar to that. You're going to start out and with effortless attention, but you're going to intentionally sustain a vigilant watch for any deviations from that. So you'll be kind of shifting from effortless to now you're maintaining vigilance in a way that you would expect not to have to in a state of effortlessness, but you're going to do it anyway. And the result should be that that relatively quickly, I would expect, you're going to find that there's no longer any tendency for dullness or distraction to enter in. Is that clear?
That's been clear. I think that
Does it
helps.
make sense to you? Yeah.
Yeah, it does. Let me just paraphrase real quick. So I'm basically now setting the intention to be really watchful and yeah, watch out for distractions, right? And then okay, perfect.
Yeah. So
I'll try
you're
that.
basically doing a form of stage 7 practice. I'm just suggesting that because you can start off with effortlessness, that you can also use some of these other practices as well.
All right, great, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I think it's quite amazing that you have that you're experiencing the joy and the tranquility. So I think you're well on your way in a very good way, and congratulations for that. You
Thank
just
you.
have this one little weakness that's holding you back, and it won't take much to correct for that.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, Marcel. When reading the Theravada Suttas and also some Mahayana sutras, the practice of the jhanas seems almost central to the path. Sama Samadhi is even defined as the jhanas. What are your thoughts on how and why the jhanas became so obscured in most present-day traditions? Also in TMI, they don't seem necessary for progress. So could you comment on that? And yes, that is something that is so very interesting. As yes, there's absolutely no question that almost the only references to meditation that you find in the Buddha's own voice are to jhanas. And there are many, many places where he defines the characteristics of the jhanas and enumerates the jhana factors and how they fall away with the different jhanas. So we find ourselves in a world with many different forms of Buddhism, none of which seem to practice much in the way of jhana anymore. It's curious, a very curious thing that people call themselves Buddhists. They study the suttas, they teach Dharma and meditation, and yet they kind of ignore this huge discrepancy between what the Buddha is referring to and what's happening, what they're actually teaching, what practices they've done, so on and so forth. Well, there's probably a variety of factors. What we do know is that with the Visuddhimagga, which came to be pretty much the foundation of Theravadan Buddhism. The description of jhana in the Visuddhimagga is of the very deepest jhanas that are difficult to attain. And it's quite possible that descriptions of jhana of such a rigorous sort and people's difficulty achieving them happened repeatedly in different places and different cultures at different times. Chan Buddhism, Chan is the Chinese equivalent for jhana in Pali or dhyana in Sanskrit. And so surely the practice of jhana carried over into Chinese Buddhism. And Zen is the Japanese version of Chan. But it seems like by the time that Chinese Buddhism moved into Japan, even though they had retained the name Chan, that the practice itself no longer resembled jhanas. So yeah, what happened along the way? That's kind of a mystery. And first of all, jhanas are an insight practice, and they are a concentration practice in the way that they're described by the Buddha. And in the Majjhima Nikaya and Sutra 111, called One by One, is a description of how Sariputta attained full awakening using the jhanas as a practice. And there are other references to jhanas leading to awakening. So there's no question that jhana is an insight practice, or was an insight practice at that time. And not only that, we can see how it's supposed to be used as an insight practice. There's basically two things that one can do, and that is to take the pre-jhanic state, the jhanic state, and the post-jhanic state after arising from each jhana and compare them and see investigate their differences. So, and this will trigger a kind of information. It's to be done repeatedly with each of the jhanas, moving ahead through and then moving backwards, moving up, moving down through the sequence of jhanas. And the other approach, insight approach, involves working with in the fourth jhana, working in the fourth jhana state with the unconscious mind directly. So we do know that that was a very common practice. We do know that it is an insight practice and was used as an insight practice. But what happened to it? Now, just to qualify this a little bit, if you look at the descriptions of the jhana in the sutras, some of them are pretty liberal descriptions, to the extent that sometimes the term jhana was using just seemingly just to refer to meditation and not specifically the absorptions. So how do we interpret that? I kind of interpret that to practice even the lightest jhanas, and this is one thing that I've come to believe, is that the Buddha taught, and the jhanas referred to in the suttas, cover a huge range from very light to very deep jhana. But then there's also the process that a person undergoes of developing sufficient concentration and mindfulness to enter into those jhanas. So I think that's why it would not be surprising, even though somebody's intention was to enter the jhanas, but they didn't quite have the development of concentration and mindfulness necessary yet, that someone that someone might refer to their practice as jhana because that's where it's leading to. That's what the purpose is. These are all speculations, but they're interesting ways to think about what might have happened. And so somewhere along the line, the jhanas that the Buddha described in detail and that are described as in a super hardcore way in the Visuddhimagga have gotten lost. One thing that shows this is there's a lot of other insight practices other than jhana. Why the Buddha doesn't mention more of them, we don't really know. The Satipatthana is, of course, a collection of insight practices. What other thoughts do I have on this thing of jhanas? Well, there was a form of jhana that preceded the Buddha. They seemed to go from first jhana straight into the formless jhanas. And the Buddha's first teachers taught him the jhanas of base of nothingness and the base of neither perception or non-perception. And he dismissed that practice of jhana. We know that prior to his enlightenment, he recalled a spontaneous jhanic experience he had as a child. And what he refers to specifically about that is the joy and happiness that he experienced. And he says, why should, he'd been practicing extreme asceticism. He says, why should I be afraid of the joy and happiness that arises in this practice? Basically because it's not joy and happiness arising out of pursuit of craving. And so he seems to have used the jhanas himself. He kind of, what it sounds to me like, it's almost as though he discovered the other form jhanas. And that's what he's describing throughout. There is a very interesting sutta where a Brahmin, and the Brahmin would have been familiar most likely with entering into the deep state of concentration, concentrated attention that corresponds to first form jhana, and then the process of immediately going into the formless jhanas from there. So he asks the Buddha, he says, how is it that one can achieve awakening by using jhana practice? And the Buddha's response is by using jhana practice with sati, with mindfulness, okay? Now, a lot of people haven't been able to figure out what that means exactly, but I think I know exactly what it means. In the first jhana, what you dispense with that allows you to practice the second, third, and fourth form jhanas is attention. Directed and sustained attention are the two jhana factors that fall away in the Buddha's system of jhana and lead to the second, third, and fourth form jhanas. And so the second, third, and fourth form jhanas are jhanas of pure mindfulness. And as I said, there are a couple of different ways of using the jhanas to achieve insight and awakening. Perhaps what got lost along the way, what certainly seems to be, in terms of misconceptions of the middle way, a very poor understanding of what the word sati was intended to refer to. What on earth was the Buddha talking about when he said sati? And there's Mind and Life conferences in the last few years that have had that of trying to determine what that is as their sole topic. And there's researchers, both scholars and laboratory researchers, trying to figure out what sati is referring to. And so it may be that the confusion about what sati was and its relationship to the jhanas is perhaps also plays a role in how they've fallen away. But I don't know. It's very strange. How come so few people have, for so long, have been practicing the way the Buddha described? There does seem to be, of course, a great rebirth in jhana practice taking place, a tremendous interest. But there's a tremendous amount of confusion being created as well, because U Ba Khin decided to invent something that he called the Vipassana jhana. And so now even the original problem 10 years ago or 15 years ago was trying to discern whether only the jhanas, the very, very deep, difficult to attain jhanas of the Visuddhimagga were the true jhanas, or whether there were lighter forms of jhana that people referred to as the Sutta jhanas. That was what the Buddha referred to. And so now we've kind of straightened that out by sort of universally recognizing that jhana can take a variety of forms, a variety of different depths. But now there's more confusion being introduced by this other category of jhanas, that of things that are called jhanas. And anyway, those are my comments and thoughts on that very interesting issue. I learned a lot myself from jhana practice, and I encourage people to do it. I haven't focused on it in the way that Paul or Lee Brasington have, because I feel like I have a more complete understanding of what's going on in these practices, and that the important thing is that not only can somebody who follows the 10 stages learn to practice all of these jhanas, but the most important thing is that in the latter stages, they have all of the benefits of jhana, but they don't have the constraints of jhana. And so, yeah. And maybe, in fact, that was what the Buddha was talking about in the suttas as well. And when he referred to jhanas, might have been people in a high state of samatha that that shared the same characteristics of the jhanas themselves. Who knows? Interesting things to think about. Thomas Bernardes, a few years ago, you reported promising results combining neurofeedback training and meditation in a 10-day retreat. What's your current opinion on the combo? Thanks in advance and hope you're feeling well. Well, thank you for your good wishes, Thomas. What we found is a specific kind of neurofeedback that's very different than other forms of neurofeedback, called Zengar. It's made by a company called Neuroptimal. And what we found that it was very effective in meditators in the early stages, even up to about stage 6, mostly seeming to make it easier for them to pass through the stages, go through the necessary purifications in stage 4, and to have, especially in those meditators which were experiencing a very high level of distractibility or resistance to practicing, that it would help them through that. It's time consuming, and we felt like it was very useful in combination, but probably not essential except for people who are really kind of stuck somewhere in the first, say, 2 to 5 stages. But we just gave up on using it because it was just too time consuming. And we're encouraging, and there are other people, there are some of the teachers in training who are making use of it Some have bought their own equipment. And I think it's potentially valuable adjunct to teaching with more resources to draw upon. I think it could be made more broadly available. That's where I am with it. It's a good combo, especially for some people, but the system is very expensive, and so a lot of meditators would be precluded from getting their own system, and so and teachers like myself, you know, I don't have the resources, human and otherwise, to make it available on a regular basis to people. So that's why I gave up that part, focused on the meditation and Dharma. Matthew Evans, until the 16th century, chairs were luxury items, and 2,500 years ago, they would have been rare. Perhaps the Buddha didn't have a chair, and that's the only reason he meditated while sitting on the floor. Is there a significant advantage the Christian has over the chair other than portability? I've seen it argued that the lotus position is best for keeping the spine straight and therefore preventing dullness. If I understand correctly from TMI, encountering dullness is inevitable anyway. Yes, this whole thing about posture. Yes, for the very few people, especially in our culture, who are capable of sitting in full lotus, it's probably the ideal way to arrange your body so that you can focus more totally on the mind and meditation practice. You still have perfect access to bodily sensations to the degree that you want and need to use them. You know, it's a wonderful position to sit in. Sitting on the floor has some advantages that similar to what full lotus has, because your body is basically unsupported. It's going to be more obvious. You're going to know when dullness is coming on, partly by being sensitive to the changes that are taking place in your body. A chair is almost as good as sitting, as long as it's not a chair where you're resting against the back, but you're just sitting up straight on a chair. But you can rest, you can meditate when leaning back in a chair, and you can successfully overcome dullness. You can meditate in a recliner. You can meditate laying on a bed, laying down. So I would suggest that, well, as I say in The Mind Illuminated, start out by finding the posture that works best for you and tweak it as you go along. But what I mean by works best for you is that the body provides the least amount of distraction, and recognize that the human body is not designed to stay still for very long. And so there's going to be discomfort associated with it. It's an opportunity to work through suffering and have a major breakthrough in fourth path, our fourth stage, a major breakthrough in understanding the relationship between the mind and the body when it comes to physical pain. You can overcome that second arrow that's described. Got a couple of minutes left. Here's Katiana's question. Yes. Thank you for the good wishes. I wondered if you could give your understanding of the term Dharmakaya, especially in reference to creative and fulfillment meditative practice. Much metta and mudita. Okay. Yeah, there are so many different interpretations of the term Dharmakaya and the emphasis that's given to it. Theravadan is quite different than Zen, and likewise in Tibetan Buddhism. But the most useful way that I find to think of that term is literally kaya is referring to the body and as embodiment of the Dharma. So that's what I like, that's the way I like to think of it. I think of it as being very closely related to the concept of Tathagata Garbha. And here my Yogacara leanings are probably coming out a bit. Tathagata Garbha basically means the embryonic Buddha that is in all of us. It gets translated as Buddha nature, and it's to be understood that it's not that each person has his own or her own Buddha nature, but rather the Buddha nature is in all of us, that there is the Tathagata Garbha, there is the embryonic Tathagata, the embryonic Buddha within each of us. And that but the Dharma is one. And so I think of it that way. The Dharma is suchness, it's emptiness, it's nirvana, but most especially it's corresponds to what I like to use the word suchness for. As the Tathagata Garbha, it's what will help lead us. It is the embryonic Buddha that's already within us, which will, if we allow it to, will lead us to full awakening. And as that happens, then we become an embodiment of the Dharma. And so in a sense, our Nirmana Kaya is the external expression of the Dharmakaya, which is the nature of our inner experience. So.
Thank you. As you've been speaking, what a wonderful, wonderful discussions you've given us today of the journey and the path to awakening, and all the different elements from the questions and all the people asked them. So again, the unity of that is so wonderful to see, hear, and see. For myself, in terms of the concept of Nirmanakaya and Dharmakaya, and they are Mahayana and Tibetan sort of, but based in Yogacara, which is very much where you also are. So where our practice and this is the power of our practice, where intention and the understanding of the Dharma and emptiness come together in terms of what we can actually create at the highest level on not just an earth reality, but a cosmic reality. And I don't know, in terms of Theravada, you've addressed it very beautifully just now by what you said, but for the Sangha here, is so wonderful that we can have this astonishing power that comes through our open heart and through our ability to direct that intention of the open heart as portals of the cosmos, as opposed to anything egotistically minded that ourselves create. So I was just interested in terms of what your thoughts were about that, and you answered that very beautifully. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. You are welcome. So we've been at this for an hour and a half. Let me see how many. Quite a few questions here. I think what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to do a catch-up Q&A sometime soon. because both Federico and William Wallen's questions could take a bit of time to discuss. So I think it may be the best thing for us to close this session now. We've certainly been at it we started a few minutes late, but it's been about an hour and a half. So Ted, can we maybe schedule something very shortly after I return from Massachusetts? And